we're gonna do a crash course. And the last few people that are coming in, just one housekeeping announcement, which is if you can move forward, we're gonna work in partners today. If there's one person sitting by themselves, then find a third person. We're gonna put the interactive in interactive because we're gonna play some games as we go through. And I always think that that's the best way to teach individuals is to have you play some games. So you're gonna need a couple of things for these games. The first thing you're gonna need is a sheet of paper. So let's take a second, ask your neighbor, let's get very friendly with each other. And if you're doing that with someone, how about you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell them where you're from, what company you're at, and grab a sheet of paper. So as we're playing these games, we're gonna have to quickly afterwards kind of come back to order. And so if I ever go like this, that's just because I would like to move on from a time standpoint because I wanna make sure that we are able to get everything in. Trust me, there'll be a lot of laughing and discussion in other pieces, and so it's very easy for us to kind of get caught in that. But I wanna make sure that we all get to experience everything. So I'm gonna start this journey in 2013 and tell you a little bit about myself to give context to how the clash of economics and behavioral science and branding all came together. Do you feel that you have a consistent positive feeling that you give to consumers for your brand or your company? Right? So we're starting off in terms of clusters. And I'll ask this another question. Do you feel that people will consistently say that your brand evokes the same feeling? Or do people have some people have good feelings towards it, some people have bad feelings towards it? All right, about 50-50. My goal is to help you build a better brand. That is my objective for today. To give you some secrets and shortcuts to how people think and how people feel so that you can immediately walk out of here with some new brainstorm techniques and some tactics that you can use to start to engineer feelings back into your brands. All right, so thank you for participating in that poll. We'll go ahead and close that out. What I want to do is tell you about this journey of teaching at Columbia. I started off as a student studying communication 10 years ago, and then switched over to being a lecturer. And each year I get to teach 2 different classes. I usually teach about 2 semesters, 14 weeks each. And so one class that I teach is on the foundation of persuasion. We start off with Aristotle and rhetoric, and we end with behavioral economics. And so what I'm going to introduce you to is that spread and spectrum of persuasion and how you get to persuasion, and we'll talk a lot about brands. And some of the brands are intentionally using these techniques, but what I often find is that brands kind of inadvertently use these techniques. Yesterday, Malcolm Gladwell spoke, right? Raise your hand, we're familiar with Malcolm Gladwell. Yeah, let's raise them a little higher. Get a good stretch in, raise the other one maybe. Okay. All right, loosen up. So the way that I've managed my career is as a scholar practitioner, which means I teach and I work. I try to find principles that come out of academic journals. I try to find principles that come out of the litany of literature and then apply those to brands. And I apply them to all sorts of brands, Fortune 100 companies and startups. And I'll tell you about some of those companies that I've applied those to. And I've managed my career like a brand manager would, spending 18 to 24 months working on a single thing and then moving on to the next thing. My goal is to extract as much knowledge from an environment as possible and then move to the next environment and apply that and start again. So my specialty is starting things over and over again. And that's what really led to my obsession of fast-growing companies and figuring out what is it about companies that help them take off. Whether that company is a digital darling or whether that company is a retail brand or if it is a large Fortune 100 company that may be doing something new for the very first time that needs to reboot and find a new source of revenue. So I said I was going to start this journey in 2013, and in 2013, I went from Harlem to Hollywood, and the job that took me there was working for Diddy, and I was running communication and PR for his $100 million startup, Revolt TV. And 2013 was a very interesting year because there was a lot of change happening across different industries, namely music and cable and television and content were all going by the way of digital. And so it was a great opportunity to leave the agency world, which I was working on clients like Bank of America and HP and McDonald's and Timberland, Capital One, and was able to go in-house. And my job there was really to create culturally infectious moments. And in 2015, one of the things that started to happen is there started to be this creative exodus, right? Who's from New York? Who's from LA? So as those two coasts have this tension, we started to see a number of companies in LA start to rise, right? Netflix, a number of BuzzFeed, and companies that were moving west in order to really invest in content. And this new creative class was starting to be born. And there were some fast-growing companies that were coming out of that. And there were a lot of older companies that were starting to take notice and starting to invest in content or hardware from a different perspective. So that same year, I ended up on Forbes 30 Under 30 for music. I was squeezed in between Meghan Trainor and Charlie XCX. And the individual that was a judge for that category was Troy Carter, who was a venture capitalist. And I went to work for him right after that. And Troy is known for a number of different things, namely being the manager of Lady Gaga for her first 3 albums, and also managing a number of other individuals. And so when I joined, we were managing John Legend and Miguel, Meghan Trainor, Charlie Puth. But one of the things that he quietly was doing over the years was investing in startups. And so for several years before, he had invested in Spotify, Uber, Lyft, Warby Parker, Dropbox, and about 80 other companies. And we wanted to do something different. We wanted to take that knowledge that he had of startups and apply that to what was happening in media entertainment to figure out what's the next wave in terms of talent, what's the next wave of big companies that are going to come as a result. That same year, he was on Shark Tank as a guest investor. And so we were preparing for this lightning rod of visibility during that moment. And my job from a day-to-day standpoint was to figure out how these startups were growing. We co-created an incubator. Within 2 weeks of announcing the incubator, we had to close applications because we had nearly 300 companies that applied. We took 6 companies and we incubated them. And so then my job switched to working with these startups on a day-to-day basis to figure out what their needs were, applying some of those lessons from the Fortune 100 companies to these 6 select companies. So in order to get to feelings, we're going to have to back up a little bit. And I want to tell you about what was happening from a technology standpoint starting from 2007, which is when I left college. And I was studying economics at the University of Chicago, and I had 2 jobs. The first job that I had was to walk through these halls of Harper Library, and all the way in the back, through those arches, through those doors, was a small computer lab. And twice a week, I'd open the doors at 8 a.m., which as a college student, no one wants to be at work at 8 a.m., especially in a computer lab, especially in the library. But I would do that because the second job was a job that I could actually work while in the computer lab, and I figured out a way to get paid twice doing something at the same time. And so I worked for a business school professor, Christian Luez, and he taught finance at Booth. And one of the things that I had to do was pull financial data down from companies so that we could study Sarbanes-Oxley. And through that, learned the mechanics and the methodology of how to analyze big data sets. And we looked at thousands of companies, and somewhere he was gracious enough to give me a credit in those journal articles. So there's a couple of principles that I want to ground us in from economics. There's 5 in total. And it's very important to how we approach branding today. And that first one is, we tend to believe that we are reasonable creatures, right? That in this reason, we can weigh features and benefits and all of these other things that we fill our creative briefs with, that we say, if only they knew, they would make a choice. The second thing is, we assume that individuals know what they want, that if we give them choice, they will choose something that is the best of those choices. We tend to think that people can judge the utility of that thing, that they can say between this choice and that choice, they know which one will accommodate the situation that they have and fulfill the needs that they have. We tend to think that there's a value that we can place on things. We know, though, that people sometimes have a hard time placing value on temporal things. If I buy a house today, how much exactly is that going to be worth in the future? If I buy a car, that's going to depreciate, but how much exactly will it depreciate? And then lastly, we tend to think that people have options that they take that are always in their own best self-interest, right? And so when people are doing what's in their own self-interest, that assumes that we don't have these other factors at play, such as community and tribes. But we know that as marketers that those things are ever present. There's one housekeeping thing that I forgot to tell you. If you are putting anything in social media, use the hashtag follow the feeling, so that way anyone who's not here can kind of see all of the things that you're talking about and group it together so that we can think about that community that can't be with us today. And outside of those walls, there was an explosion happening, 2007, 2016, and we started to see brands approach marketing in a different way. And I love this image of what Apple does because many consumers today, we think about them in terms of empty demographics, right? They're kind of masked. We don't really know exactly who they are on an individual level, but what we do know is that they're tethered to an internet of things, and they're hidden behind firewalls. And we're trying to find out, how do we get that person to like us, to love us, to recommend us as a brand? In 2007, when I left, we were also seeing the start of digital, right? A lot of marketers were questioning their above-the-line investments, and a lot of places were figuring out, when is this tipping point going to happen? And it finally happened in 2018, that marketers started spending more money on digital than they did other channels. I pride myself on trying to be an early adopter. Now, half of the world is on Facebook at this point. But I was in the initial 100,000 people because Mark Zuckerberg's sister, Donna, was in our college class. And so when her and her brother came up with the idea to change Facebook into thefacebook.com, she brought it to our campus. And so we've been using this technology for a long time. And I had a sense in my gut, this is going to be potentially big because the way that it is aggregating community, the way that it's taking content is something that we haven't seen since MySpace. Leaving school, I knew that I did not want to go into finance. I knew that I wanted to go and do something that was creative. And so I started to look around and ended up in a place called Ogilvy. And at that time, they were celebrating some of the biggest and largest campaigns. And so when I learned brand strategy and brand planning, I learned it off of the types of case studies such as Dove Real Beauty campaign. I learned it off of Amex and what they were doing with Beyonce and Ellen DeGeneres, and what they were doing with IBM in terms of the US Open and trying to apply data to sports. And that time saw a lot of change. In 10 years, there was a radical shift that was happening between brands and brand value and how we define value and where that brand value came from. And the companies that were rising most in terms of brand value were the companies that were investing in digital. And so we saw a new crop of companies that really moved from a physical and retail standpoint, that moved into a digital realm of Apple and Amazon, that Google in terms of investments. The internet was reshaping. In 2008, one of the first jobs that I had after working for Ogilvy was going to a little agency known as Organic. And there for 2 years, I worked on omni-channel strategy for Bank of America. And just by a show of hands, who uses mobile banking today? Almost everyone, right? Well, if you can believe it, in 2008, that number was under 10%. We had a very difficult time trying to convince individuals to move into mobile banking. And when the CMO of Bank of America called us, she said, I'm having a little trouble because there's this rogue employee in Arizona who is tweeting back at customers. We're like tweeting back customers, right? Twitter had just launched at the time. A lot of brands didn't have a strategy for how to be conversational or how to deal with customer service in different ways. And so we were really being pushed to think about digital and what it meant in order for brands to be responsive. And we wrote the governance strategy for Bank of America to get them on Twitter. And since then, it kept being a continual cycle of big brands saying, how do I take into account what's happening from a digital standpoint? All of those digital interactions started creating an explosion of content. The brands that started winning in terms of digital were brands that were measuring. They were taking in all of these metrics, and all of those metrics started to do something which was interesting, which is really entangle marketers in this web of data. And if there's one thing that you should know about data is you really can get data to prove anything that you want. And data also can mask what's really happening under the surface if you have too many data points, right? And so it's not uncommon now that when a new platform or technology launches, that there is a number of different data points that comes out. Now, for individuals from brands, how many have dashboards or some type of tracking that they do between all their data, right? A lot of individuals. Raise them higher, be proud, just do that stretch. Okay. Between all those 100 different data points, here's what's happening. Who's been to the Statue of Liberty? All right. The Statue of Liberty is 300 feet high from the base of it to the top. I want everyone to put their thumb in the air. Okay. So in 2017, Facebook's team did some research, and what they found is that we scroll on our phones through 300 feet of content a day. So we do a little exercise. Let's imagine we're walking up the Statue of Liberty with our thumb every day. All right. Can you imagine that? All of that content between all of the apps that you're opening and closing, your email, all the notifications that you're getting. And what that's doing is it's redefining the role that a brand plays. It's redefining the relationship that that brand has with us. And it's really taken us from this place of being really static to having to be engaging, taking us from a place of being in one channel to having to be ubiquitous across different channels, right? And in the future, that will continue to happen. And so in looking at this change over the last couple of years, the 10 years that I've been in marketing especially, I got worried. And I said, well, we are optimizing brands for data, and all the data that we're getting, a lot of individuals are not trained data scientists and don't really know how to use this data. And so we're making a lot of approximations based on this data. And in doing that, we're really losing sight and focus of emotions and feelings. And we're trying to put ourselves in as many screens and channels as possible based on that, right? In terms of our media buys, we want reach, we want repetition. A lot of marketers optimize against share of voice, and I've done a lot of those reports, so I play a guilty part in that, where we try to make sure that we have as much share of voice as possible rather than resonance, and really thinking about what does resonance matter. So in making brands matter, we really have to look at a different set of metrics. And what I want to impress upon you today, the argument that I will try to make, is that the most important brand metric is how you make other people feel. That's it. Whether you are a Fortune 100 company, whether you are a startup, or whether you are a nonprofit, and even an individual as a brand, it's simply how you make others feel. And I'll tell you the 5 ways that brands that have been fast growing have been getting other individuals to feel something, so that you have some tactics that you can bring to think about your own brand. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Black Mirror side of feelings and how we measure this stuff from an interactive standpoint, and how some of the companies that are around us, like the Intels and Googles of the world, are investing in the next big set of data, which is around feelings. So we're gonna do our second poll now. And the second poll is around your favorite brand. So if you want to write this on your paper, you can write this on your paper. But what I'm going to ask is that you participate in the Slido. And we'll get a nice word cloud going. And so just think of the brand that you like the most. Regardless of what industry the brand is in, you can make sure that that brand has a feeling that is wired into it. Because when we think about engineering behavior and changing minds, winning hearts, I want to talk to you about the relationship between economics and communication. You see, economics is all about incentives. The goal is to change behavior. Communication is about getting someone to take an action, and they're cousins in that way. And in their DNA lives influence. And if you can crack that code in terms of how to influence individuals, then your brand can rise above competitors. And one of the things I want to say that we teach at Columbia is awareness is not an objective. And it's very difficult as marketers to say, well, only if they know that it's an option, or we just want to be part of the consideration set, or we just want to do this brand spot and have people feel good. But awareness is not an objective. We are in the game of changing behavior, and that behavioral change requires actions to be taken. And so unless there's an action that's on the other end, then from an economic standpoint and from a communication standpoint, that tactic didn't work, that initiative didn't work, that effort didn't work. And so we always try to push past awareness and focus on behavior. But when we look at behavior, what we find is that those things that we thought were happening from an economic standpoint that came from the 1700s when our country was being founded, when France was being founded, is actually changing. It's actually evolving. More ways that we know. And all of these digital connections that we have is creating new pressure points on that change. So who's read Freakonomics? Yeah, Freakonomics fans? So I was a big fan of Freakonomics when it first came out because I was a fan of Stephen Levitt, who was a professor at the University of Chicago while I was there. And despite all of my attempts to try to take one of his classes, I couldn't. But Freakonomics taught us to look at questioning and asking questions in a different way, to probe, and to try to figure out what's happening under the surface when it comes to consumers. And technology has helped us to figure out and put measurement against those things. And so we always think, well, this technology may hurt us, this technology may have to get reined in, we may not know how people are going to use this technology for bad. The good side of it is we do learn more things about individuals. For instance, how they shop. So when we put technology in the eyes of consumer, we can start to see what's happening on the journeys as they're choosing different things. And so in this study that was done out of Indiana University, one of the things that we learned is in a grocery store environment, it takes about 8 seconds for someone to choose your brand if you only have words and no identifiable packaging in terms of shape or in terms of color that's used. It takes someone 6 seconds if you have a distinguishable color, and it takes someone 2 seconds if you have both a distinguishable color and shape, right? And so when we start to apply technology in different ways, then we can start to understand how can we build better brands? How can we engineer behavioral choice into what individuals are doing on a regular basis? I want to talk to you a little bit more about psychology, and then I promise we're going to get to the games. So in a traditional communications model, there's messages that go in, there's things that go out. And they spread across a number of different mediums, and it used to be more one-to-one. But now with so many mediums and individuals multitasking, right? then individuals are crossing their wires in terms of what they may be seeing or hearing or doing. One semester, I invited Dr. Garcia from the Advertising Research Foundation. And he was doing a piece of research on how many people exactly multitask and what effect that has for television advertising and what effect that has for mobile. And what he found is that 76% of individuals watching television within the US also have their mobile phones not just around them, but in their hand, which means these messages are experiencing a wide amount of noise. And it's all of that noise that exists within the world that's around us. And unless we have some type of feedback, then we don't know if that message worked. And this is one of the core reasons why we say awareness is not an objective. Because yes, you can test through brand studies or longitudinal studies or asking individuals if they are aware of something, if they have that sense of brand familiarity. But the best metric for feedback is the actions that you can measure based on those individuals. So when we experience all this noise, we can kind of wave bye to our marketing messages unless you have some type of closed feedback loop built into it. So I want you to draw a circle on that page. Just draw a little circle because you're going to make a pie chart. And when we think about communication as a system, and I'm a firm believer in systems thinking, then these are the elements of that system, right? And so what I want you to do on that pie chart is figure out of these three things, what percentage would you give them? How important is verbal and words? How important are nonverbal cues such as sounds and visuals? And then how much of that is delivery? Let's give you a couple of seconds to think about that. How would you break down that pie chart? Anyone was spot on with a number? Anyone was close? 1 or 2%? Anyone shocked by it? Yeah, a couple of people, right? One of the first things that we do from a marketing standpoint is we write a creative brief. And I've written many creative briefs. And so we're automatically taking what is supposed to be an emotional experience that a consumer is going to feel on the other end, and we're cramming it into one format in terms of words. And arguably, the one format that doesn't have the most expression from a communication standpoint, the one format that's going to require someone such as a creative team or production team to take a lot of liberty to figure out how do I translate this into what actually is going to move the needle, such as sounds and visuals and other forms of communication. And one of those individuals that got curious about it was Daniel Kahneman. And Daniel Kahneman, if you have read Thinking Fast and Slow, he also won the Nobel Prize in 2002 for his work in behavioral science. He has conjectured that most of the time we are coasting, right? And that most is actually 95% of the time. Now, since he's come out with those works in the early 2000s, another professor at Harvard Business School, Gerald Zaltman, has done extensive research to back that up. And what researchers have found is not only the majority of time we are making decisions in autopilot, because we make about 35,000 decisions in a day, but the majority of those decisions are influenced by emotions. So if we don't understand not only the emotional state and context that someone is in, then we can miss opportunities. There's a Portuguese neuroscientist and a UCLA professor, Antonio Damasio. And what he says is, we're just feeling machines. We tend to think that we're thinking machines. And where does that come from? So when I think back to Aristotle, I have to also think of one of his students, Plato, because it was him who said, I think, therefore I am, right? So a lot of individuals kind of place this preference on thinking. Think, feel, do. It becomes this kind of linear process that individuals are trained on from a strategy standpoint. And that process is really broken. People do think, but not the majority of the time. People feel the majority of the time. And sometimes we place a priority on doing, but sometimes we place a priority on awareness. So it's not exactly as linear as we think. And we know that feelings can happen with the void of thought at the same time. So what about all these feelings? Because a lot of individuals say, well, emotions, we only have a couple of emotions, and there's not really that many, so how much depth and texture does that give marketers if we're going to target that? There's actually about 34,000 emotions that have been coded. Now, those emotions do have families. And the way that you think about the difference between emotions and feelings is that emotions is a really short-term state, right? So think of a bee sting. It stings you, goes away. A feeling is a prolonged state, right? That you may feel over the course of a day, over the course of a month, over the course of a year. And so when I say feelings, I'm talking about more than one engagement. Not just in that one moment that someone does something right at a store, you call a call center, but something that is consistent time and time again over a brand. And those emotions we can start to split out into three categories. We can tell whether they're pleasurable, right? Is it something that we find enjoyment out of? Is it something that arouses us in the sense of stimulation? Or is it something that is dominant? We know that certain emotions, such as anger, have a higher priority within us in terms of other emotions. And it's this research that has informed how we look at certain psychological conditions like bipolar disorder, right? When we're trying to find what are those spectrums of emotions with different tensions. And this specific illustration is Plutchik's wheel. It comes from research that he's done in 30 different countries with 65,000 participants. And over the past few decades, it has been widely adopted and accepted as kind of the official way that we codify emotions from a psychology standpoint. Whenever we make an enemy out of something, it becomes a really great tactic in order to amplify the emotions. When Snickers aired this in 2010, they were number 2 in terms of worldwide candy confectionery. Within 2 years, by 2012, they became number 1, passing Hershey's. They became number 1 in 56 of 58 markets that they were in. They had a 16% sales increase during that 2-year period. And it is a positioning that they retained through 2015. And so then we get back to 2015. And seeing what was happening from the surface level of all those changes in terms of big companies, the way that people were using the internet, the way that individuals were plugging into data, all this data that was being created led to another fascination. And that fascination took me back to the place that started my career, which was Ogilvy. And if anyone knows what's happening in advertising right now or marketing at large, we know there's a lot of new entrants, right? Because one of the things that all that data did is it created an opportunity for Accenture and McKinsey and Deloitte to all figure out what's happening with marketing stacks, what's happening with technology, how are we using all these things to inform experience. And by 2016, 6% of S&P companies had a chief experience officer. And we continue to add to the C-suite in terms of experience officers. At that same time, IBM was doing research, and they partnered with Oxford Economics. And what they found is that 85% of CMOs worldwide, they did this research with 2,000 CMOs, and 85% said experience is the biggest threat that they have to their business. And when we look at all of kind of these digital darlings that were popping up, we had this fascination at work. And the fascination was to figure out what is it about these companies that are making them win as companies are trying to find digital transformations. And so we pulled lessons out of different growth lanes that they were using in order to best their competitors. And so one Fortune 100 company after another, we started informing digital transformations. We worked on unpacking the future of different industries, and we started wiring innovation into different processes. So at the end of that year, Columbia came back and they said, would you like to create another class? And I said, yes, I'll create another one to help fill a gap. And who's known the Golden Circle, or Start With Why, the work of Simon Sinek? All right. So I modeled it after him because Simon Sinek taught in the same program that I did at Columbia. And I said, well, what worked with what he did was a systems-based approach. And so if there's a new system that's going to be built and created for a time in which digital and all of this data is taken hold of us and really creating this noisy environment that brands have to operate in, what would that system look like? And that system looked a lot like principles that included behavioral economics, principles that included behavioral science. So when we think about follow the feeling, I looked at 1,500 companies last year. And those 1,500 companies were built on different signals that individuals were giving, right? So what are we considering the most innovative companies? What are we considering hot startups? Who's disrupting different industries? Who has brand relevance? Who's giving brand meaning? And based on that, 5 things emerged. So the one thing I want you to do is to draw this diagram. We're going to fill in these 5 things. These are the 5 things that you should know and be thinking about. Then I'm going to give you an example of each, and we're very quickly going to play a game for each one of these. And I call it Levesque because that's the order in which it should happen. But if it's easier for you to remember, and if you're in a global spirit or attitude, you can call it clave, which means magic key in Spanish. It means key, but it's the magic key. So the first one's lexicon, right? And lexicon is all about vocabulary. Certain things that companies were doing in order to win vocabulary. The second one is audio and sonic branding. The third one is visual stimuli and figuring out which visual lane helps make your brand the most conversational. The fourth, is experience drivers. And then the last is internal culture. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples for each one. So when we start off with this first place of lexicon, what we're doing is we're breaking down different associations people have, taxonomy that individuals have, and trying to find the right triggers. And often we may accomplish this through brainstorm techniques like word clouds or kind of nuancing. If you've ever gone through like a naming strategy and you're coming up with hundreds or thousands of potential names for a product or a service, and you're looking at lexicon and origins and heritage and a number of different things that may connect with people. And it works on a very basic level like this. You should be able to tell someone a couple of words, and they should be able to tell you what that thing is associated with. And I'll take you one step further. There's 3 things that every phrase has associated with it, right? You can consider these kind of digital mental tags that exist in people's minds. And the first one is we think in terms of categories, right? So if I say this is toothpaste, then we think in terms of associations. This toothpaste is minty. And then the third thing we remember is the framing that someone has. And whoever is making the argument can create that frame, right? It's just the selection of facts that you may choose. Often that framing comes in the wake of different superlatives that we may use. So we may say this minty toothpaste is the best. That is a logically sound argument that is going to start to evoke and encode an emotion in someone. So I want to do a quick draw thing. And what we're going to do is you have 20 seconds. So just think of Pictionary. You're going to share this with your neighbor. And this is where the points begin. So at the top of your paper, you're going to track all the points that you're going to get in the next 10 minutes. And so I want you to draw a bike. Now show those bikes to your neighbor. And between the two of you in the next 10 seconds, figure out who drew the best bike, and that person gets a point. All right, so the next thing that I want you to draw, and there's only 2 things that you're going to draw. So the next thing I want you to draw is, you have the same amount of time, 20 seconds. The next thing is innovation. All right, now show your neighbor and figure out who drew the best innovation, and then that person gets a point. All right, so by way of show of hands, who found it easier to draw innovation? Who found it easier to draw the bike? All right. So there's a concept known as concreteness versus palateness. Palateness being abstraction. And this is the test that I want you to use when you're coming up with positioning or taglines or anything else that you're putting in front of your clients. Copy, pitch decks. If someone can draw it, then it mentally is strong enough in terms of their mind. If someone cannot draw it, they likely do not know what you're talking about. Regardless of how many times they nod their head, yes, that they do. And we use a lot of this empty language, right, in terms of the way that we handle marketing, the way that we go and pitch in terms of business development, where we say things like innovation and disruption and this big word and that big word, and we think that those buzzwords actually have meaning and that they're doing something, but in actuality, they're not leaving anyone in any type of emotional state except for confusion. So I want to challenge you to try to break down those larger terms into terms that individuals can mentally come up with a visual for. And so there's a test that I want to give you. And you can Google this, you can go online, put your communications in it, and what it will do is help to make sure that you are speaking at the right level so that you connect with the audiences that you're trying to. And it's called the Flesch-Kincaid test. It was developed in the 1970s by the US Navy. It's used today by the government for legislation. It's used for different manuals that are written. And basically, the US Navy said, we need a way of standardizing education or measuring education across all of the different states that individuals are coming from, since every state has a different set of standards. And what they found is that using this, they're able to come up with different procedures and communication for the entire government of the US. And so if you work in politics or campaigning, you may be more familiar with this because a lot of communications are tested on that level. And I've used this for executives in the past to make sure that they're speaking in terms that they can connect with their audience about. Now, the majority of us can learn a language by knowing just a couple of lemmas. And basically, a lemma is kind of the root word, and then there's conjugations of that. And so when we think of different words, they essentially break down to these different lemmas. So I want to give you another test to see where you may fall, or to give you a sense of where you may fall on this scale of different lemmas. And the average person knows about 15 to 20,000. So most people are going to be in that 1 to 7,000 range. And what I want you to do is take that paper and create 2 columns. You're going to write 5 words in each column, or as many words as you can within the 30-second allotment. And in the first one, you're going to write words that you think trigger negative emotions. In the second one, you're going to write words that trigger positive emotions. After this 30 seconds, I'm going to show you both, and then you can test to see which of you fail within this spectrum. And there was research done looking at 150,000 of the top books written all around the world from the past 200 years. And what they did is they started to look at story arches and apply artificial intelligence to figure out, based on certain words that were negative or positive based on sentiment, when a story was about to change in terms of an arc. So that's where this list of words originates from. But I want you to see if you can figure out how to hit a negative word and put a negative emotion in someone versus a positive word and put a positive emotion in someone. So these are the most negative words in the English language, according to researchers. These are the words that you probably never, ever, ever want your brand to be associated with. Right, so as we think about brand safety, as we think about kind of what may be in comments, as we think about paid search, as we think about all those places that people are having conversations, And these are the most positive. And these are two lists of words that immediately pushes someone into a certain frame around your brand. So the last lexicon thing that I'll leave you with is thinking about the 3 moments, and you don't have to do this now, but it's just a technique. Think about the 3 moments that you and your competitors use similar language, right? And what you want to try to do is create branded vocabulary. And for this game, I'm going to play a couple of audio clips, and I want you to think of and write down how many sounds you have. If you need to close your eyes to figure that out, then that may help. And I'll try to remember to say the number. There's 12 in total. But what we know, audio is growing exponentially, right? 25% of households now have a smart speaker. Amazon Alexa and voice controlled is also in 25% of US households. They sold 100 million Echoes last year. Podcasts reached a tipping point of crossing a chasm at 40%. Streaming music has also crossed a chasm in terms of 40%. The music industry that everyone said was dying hit a 6-year high last year, right? Sales of cassettes and vinyls hit a 10-year high last year. When we think about voice and the power of voice, there's a number of brands, especially within the fitness category, that places a premium in terms of voice. And I call this next one the Bird Box test, right? So imagine your consumers are blindfolded and they have to find your brand. Are they able to actually find your brand in a world where you cannot show them a visual? A lot of brands will fail this test. Martin Lindstrom in biology actually put a number to this, and he said 83% of brands focus on visuals alone. That leaves 17% of brands that have a really great strategy when it comes to audio. But the majority of brands, no one would know who you are indistinguishable based on audio. So just a quick sound check, do that one more time, make sure everyone can hear it. All right, here's the 12 sounds. Ready? So if you want to write 1 through 12 on a paper, we're going to go through these. It's number 1. Number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Number 5. Number 6. I'm loving it. All right, we're halfway through. Number 7. All right. Number 8. That's number 9. Okay, number 10. Number 11. And the final one, number 12. Those are some of the most common brand sounds, most recognizable and most trademarked. We hear them every single day in different experiences and environments, and here's what they are. So you want to add up how many points you got for that one? And so this is what we're going to do. After this session ends, I'm going to go outside. Anyone who may have a question or want to talk, I'm more than happy to share more of these materials afterwards. We won't get through all of it. And so I'm going to skip to a couple of visuals that I think are very important. These are the things that you may want to snap and take a picture of. If anyone follows me on LinkedIn and then messages me, I'm happy to send these slides to you so that you have them. One game, can anyone name these brands? Number 1, Tiffany. 2, T-Mobile. 3, Barbie pink. These are trademarked colors. 4, UPS. 5, 3M. 6, Cadbury, right? Anyone can finish this line? Any music fans? Happiness is the price, same price as what? As red bottoms, right. And Christian Louboutin has that patent in the US. There's a lot of brands that have smiles, but we kind of associate that most with Amazon. It kind of makes us feel really great. I'm sorry, I realize I'm making a lot of people mad right now, but I want to get to this one thing. And then I'm serious, so if you message me, I will give you these materials. And this is the one thing. This is what you're trying to get at. You want to make sure that you build a tribe with the lexicon that you have. You develop instant recognition through audio cues. You have visual stimuli that makes your brand conversational in the medium that matters, so whether it's GIFs, or whether it is visuals, that may be video, that experienced drivers, you create a system, a closed feedback loop, that you make sure there's ways that consumers can actually tell you whether you're doing a good job or not. And then lastly, in terms of internal culture, that you make sure that you're aligning what you're saying and what you're doing. And when we look at brands that do that best, generally Disney tends to fall into that category. Patagonia tends to fall into that category, right? So if you want to continue along on this journey, there's a series of weekly posts that I'll be putting on LinkedIn. The first one went up on Thursday. It's a lot of content to get through in 60 minutes. And so we'll take the next couple of weeks and we'll continue to unpack one by one what each of these means. Thank you very much. Sorry we did not have time for questions, and I will share this out.